So welcome to our last portion of the Graha, the planets, and this one is called the shadows, or the Chaya Graha. Now, the shadows aren't necessarily planets. They are the ecliptic points, and as such, they represent the portals to the collective unconsciousness, or unconscious. Um, this is a cross-cultural examination. More so, we're going to be studying the Indian viewpoint. Sorry if you hear lightning and thunder outside. I chose a very stormy day to talk about some very stormy concepts. But this is, we're going to focus on the Indian system because it's the most complete, in my opinion. So these are two types of eclipses we have. Quite simply in the top, you see that the moon is coming in between the light, or kind of blocking the light from the sun and creating this umbra, this shadow, this penumbra. And from Earth, this would look like a solar eclipse. The sun would be blotted out in the sky. And below here we have the opposite, although they're all aligned. And this alignment, this mathematical alignment, these points are called the nodes. But in the bottom one, we have a lunar eclipse where the Earth passes between the moon and the sun. And the Earth, quite simply, blocks the light from the sun, so the moon turns blood red. So this is the basic configuration. We're going to go over some some sort of astronomical information as we move through the presentation. Because you kind of have to know the astronomy to understand what these nodes represent, because they're not something we can look at. We have to, they're much more subtle, and they're shadows. They're inherently shadows. So the nature of shadows is like ignorance and darkness and things that aren't illuminated or that we don't yet know, right? It's things that are inaccessible to us, or things beyond the veil. So of all the planets, the northern and the southern nodes have the capacity to be more powerful than any other, because they actually swallow, they eat, they devour, they block, they hide the light from the moon and the sun. Or depending on whether it's a solar or a lunar. Whenever you put them side by side, you see that there's a concept of Ouroboros in alchemy, which is a serpent that's eating itself, and it kind of just, this translates to the all is one. 3rd century Egypt is where it's from. It's like the alchemical basics. That energy does not die, it transforms. So they represented this system of cyclical energy as a dragon or a snake. And historically, dragons have always been sort of snake-like. They didn't used to necessarily fly as much as we think in a modern sense. But yeah, the serpent was elected to represent this axis, this mathematical shadowy axis. And on the left, you see a solar eclipse, a total solar eclipse. And on the right, you see a lunar eclipse. And they look very differently. And when you put them together, they look like eyes. And this is what I think the eyes of the dragon look like. This one is the eyes of Rahu, and this is the eye of Ketu, the southern node. North node, southern node. The northern node tends to favor eating the moon in the stories, and the south node favors eating the sun. So they're different, even though they're both eclipses, they're different in flavor. They're very, 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 a person born during a solar eclipse is going to be totally different than a person born on a lunar eclipse for a variety of reasons. And cross-culturally, we have this symbol. Oh my God, this resolution. It always looks worse in the presentations. Basically people have been realizing, like Long, the Chinese dragon, it's very serpent-like. It represents all sorts of things, but essentially like timeless, essential, primordial knowledge or information. I think in the Chinese system, or was it the Japanese, that a dragon is a snake that has lived 1,000 years in the ocean, like in this one, and then 1,000 years in the mountains, and then can gain the ability to fly. And it moves through the mist of the mountains to hide itself. And here's another representation of the infinity symbol. Well, this is an alchemical image that is interesting, and I won't go too much into it. But basically, what I'm trying to say here with these next few slides is that the spiraling energy is ruled by the serpent, and we can see that in the staff of the medical industry in the West. This double helix that is DNA is seen in the serpent's dance up the staff. That becomes a tool for our greater awareness, moving from the subconscious to the conscious. And each in this system, the schematic, that there's each planet represents a different protein, and the luminaries represent the bonds that actually occur between the two strands, and you have an ascending and a descending strand. One is the northern node and would represent one part of the axis, and the other represents the other dragon, the other strand of the DNA helix. Basically, my point being that, spirals are one of the most powerful energetic forces, because and if you've ever, I was born in Oklahoma, and I've seen tornadoes touch down, and there's no denying, if you've ever been in a tornado, that spirals are very, very, very powerful. They connect the heavens to the earth. Through the atmosphere. It's really, really a spiritual experience to see a tornado, especially if it rips up and destroys your entire life, which I've experienced. So my point being that, you can mathematically prove it. You can there's all different ways to show that spiraling energy compounds upon itself. And as such, the energy of our past action is spiraling behind us like a freight train, and we're gaining momentum as we take life after life. And so, this spiraling motion is represented by the sun and the moon. And, you have moons orbit around, the moon is orbiting around the earth. Then you have the sun that's also spiraling through space. So it's it's really intense. I'm actually going to show a a new video, and this video is representative of the spiraling motion of our planets. And so you can see that this is the old model, or this is how we typically conceptualize the heliocentric model of the sun going through. It's not correct. We also are producing motion through the sky, but the whole solar system itself is moving, and so we get spiraling energy. Now this is where the serpent comes in, and the serpent as a symbol, and where the vortex energy of the nodes shows that all of these configurations of the planets as they're moving through the sky collect and are following and tracing behind us. But that is where karma comes from, and that's how the planets are called the graha, and they are the agents of zipping around us and delivering the fruits of our karmas to us. Yeah, so definitely this video is saying and this is a really good shot, I love this. If you look through the motion and try to interpret the patterns of time, that's the point of astrology, is this kind of meta layer, looking at all of the different orbital motions and patterns and celestial bodies and events. And one of the main rhythms we use for this is the Saros cycle, which is the ecliptic cycle. And that's where the northern and the southern nodes, the shadow planets, are actually like a metronome, in the sense that they keep a certain amount of rhythm relative to collective consciousness and collective unconsciousness. Does that make sense? Okay, so back to this one, we have, as this motion, keeping that spiraling motion in mind, there's only 2 seasons which eclipses are possible. And I'll tell you why. The moon's path and the sun's path aren't aligned perfectly. So as the sun was moving through the sky, you have an inclination in the orbit. And so as such, the ascending node is when the moon is above the line, is above the sun. And you have the descending node, which represents, the descending axis, which is half of the orbit, which the moon is underneath the sun. So during new moons and full moons, when out here, there's not going to be eclipses. There's only going to be eclipses whenever the 2 axes come together and the Earth, the moon, and the sun can all line up perfectly. And that's why this is a metronome, because it's like tick, tock, tick, tock. So we usually get 2 eclipses per season, and there's 2 seasons. So that's usually around 4 eclipses a year. And the Saros cycle, which we won't get into too much this time, is how we, one Saros cycle is like 1,200 years. So ecliptic patterns are a huge study that the Babylonians developed, and it was a huge mathematical testament that they were even able to calculate the nodes, right? Because it's kind of hard to predict, when the nodes or when the eclipse is going to happen unless you have really good advanced math. So the nodes symbols are these little headphones. The left is the north node or the ascending node, like we just talked about, and the right is the descending node. The north node on the left is considered Caput Draconis in some alchemical texts, which means head of the dragon, and that's in an Indian system we call it Rahu. And the right one is Ketu, or the tail of the dragon. Why a head and why a tail? Because they think that they used to be connected but are now severed, or there's a different function between the two. One is reversed, one is the opposite, one is the contrary of the other. And that symbol comes from the cobra. And interestingly, if you're looking at a cobra from behind, you're going to be looking at it tail first. And this is the tail symbol. Get it? The story in the Indian system goes basically that the angels and the demons, or the angels and the rebel angels, the Asura and the Devas, were churning the milk ocean, and they were trying to find the elixir of immortality. Well, whenever Lakshmi came out of the milk ocean, and Dhanvantari, the god of medicine, and elephants and deer, whatever else, all these magical, mystical, amazing objects of the accumulated effort of divine and dark forces, right? Everyone sat down to enjoy the fruits of their labor, except the gods were planning on keeping the immortal nectar to themselves, except the demon, Rahu, and Kate, or the god demon mixture, sat in between the moon and the sun and tried to have a single drop of the immortal nectar, not before Vishnu, disguised as Mohini, the most beautiful woman, threw a chakra, Vishnu's discus, and beheaded the demon. But as you can see, even in being beheaded, there's still facial expressions on this entity because he's now immortal. The drop went down the throat, and now we have 2 entities instead of 1. And so very much the nodes represent what we're separating from, what we are separated from, and the things in our lives and forces we are trying to bring together. Solve coagula. That's sort of like the Hermetic and alchemical basic motto, is like dissolve and reunite. Dissolve, purify, and then reunite. Right? And you do that multiple times over. That's similarly the same system for how we make bhasma in Ayurveda, which is like medicated ashes, or medicated things. There's a system of purification where you separate, purify, bring together, purify. And as such, toxic metals can become digestible to the body, and you can actually understand and work with these toxic metals. And that's something that the northern and the southern nodes represent. Is usually they represent things we don't have much experience with, or things that we have extra vulnerabilities for, or things that can just be downright toxic or destructive to us. The northern node, the head of the dragon, this is an interpretation like the Tibetan, Rahula, many eyes, many mouths you can see here. When the head of the dragon or the demon was decapitated, he no longer has a stomach to gauge when he's full. And in fact, in this image, it's great because his stomach is just another mouth. So he can really never, ever, 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 ever be satiated. And it's a very demonic image of fire. But there's still divine. The demon doesn't mean not divine. No, they have great, Rahula has amazing gifts and gives amazing can change your circumstances on the physical plane really well. And, he represents where you hunger and that which cannot be unseen. So they can represent our scars and our traumas, but they also represent Rahu, the northern node, that northern ecliptic point represents, our sense of ambition or where we lack satisfaction. In a modern English American sense, this is the guy who wrecked himself because he didn't check himself, right? And this tends to be where we overdo it, where we go too hard, where we're too ambitious, and where we burn ourselves out and exhaust ourselves or destroy ourselves in some cases. Rahu can represent addictions and, excess, grandeur, a sense of pride that is swollen beyond all belief. And, here we can see these luminaries, the ecliptic luminaries. So this is, well, this should be a little bit further along. The northern, actually I put these backwards. Anyway, we'll go to this one. Yeah, the northern node likes to eat the moon primarily, or mostly. And the concept is that the panther or jaguar attacks the moon, punctures its throat or whatever, and the moon is now dying and bleeding. So it's the panther seizes the luminary. The panther, of course, being the dragon's head. This is Mayan, Mexican, South American. It's like a predator, but it's, instead of, it's a big cat, right? Because what does a dark black big cat like to hunt in? Shadows, at night. Of course, this is the perfect symbol as well. I would say the rival symbol to the snake is a panther, but it could just be because I'm Mexican. But yeah, so the northern node that we just described, the head loves eating the moon. And that's because the moon was, or the demon was sitting between, if we go back, was sitting between the sun and the moon. So it's like their revenge that they, for all eternity now, are able to harass and swallow the luminaries. Of course, it was all a part of a bigger plan that, this was all a divine circumstance that created harmony and that in the cosmos. So this wasn't an accident. This was all preordained. The southern node represents solar eclipses, or the southern node, the tail of the dragon, has an affinity for blocking the sun, and the solar crescent, that's where, an annular solar eclipse is what we see here, where the moon is too small to really block out all of the light of the sun. So you get the fiery ring around the eclipse. And this is not a total eclipse in the image behind the drain, which we'll talk about. But nevertheless, it's an eclipse. And some say it's even a more volatile eclipse. But basically, Ketu, the southern node, is about, mind over ego, dominion over the soul. It can represent impulses, a spiritual death or a reboot. It's the door of Anubis left ajar. It's a portal where things can suddenly appear or suddenly disappear. Things can be suddenly given to us, like millions of dollars, or suddenly taken from us, like, an illness or an accident or something. They're very mysterious, but the southern node also can show possession and suicide. It can show a blockage of energy or a blockage of will or an eclipse of the soul, which could very much be used to describe a suicide. So the solar energy is blocked, but the magnetic energy of the sun is still available during the middle of the day in a solar eclipse. Now that's energy because, it's drawing energy. So as such, I think there's tremendous amounts of magnetic energy hidden in these portals. And I do the picture of a drain because that's what happens to energy. It's pulled towards it like it's being sucked through. That's what the southern node does. Is it dissolves energy? It like pulls things into oblivion. And the solar eclipse won't be visible to everyone. Like this happened in 2017, the total solar eclipse, the Great American Eclipse. And the path of totality is where that shadow of the moon actually acts like the discus of Vishnu and sears across the throat of America, right? I like to think of that as like that point being an incision, and that point where, you know, Vishnu beheaded the dragon. So it's like their revenge, and they laser gridded across a certain place. And sometimes it's in the middle of the ocean where nobody gets to see it, or sometimes it's where everybody in the North American continent gets to see it, like happened last August, this great American solar eclipse. You know, so, you know, this is the total path of, you know, this is the path of totality, the umbra. And then the penumbra is where you'll see these variances of the eclipse. You only get to see, you know, you'll only see like a crescent sun. That's all you'll get. I was in Louisiana, so we got this kind of like, you know, it wasn't total, but it was still it was very, very intense. What does it look like in a chart? You know, you'll see the headphone next to the moon and the sun for a solar eclipse. And you'll see that they're 4 degrees. You know, they have to be within like 15 degrees for there to be a chance of an eclipse. And this one definitely is showing the eclipse for the that solar eclipse that I just showed you. This one, this is what it looked like in a chart. You see how the headphones are right next to the sun and the moon? So we know it's going to be a solar eclipse, because if it was a lunar eclipse, the moon would be on the other side of the chart, and it would be a configuration for a full moon. So this is normally just a configuration for a new moon, right? 28 degrees sun, 28 degrees moon. Well, when it's on the ecliptic axis, on the node, when it's on Rahu, then that's when you have an eclipse of the sun. Well, these are the paths of the solar eclipses in the last 20 years. The blue ones are total eclipses, more powerful, and the red ones are annular, or more total. The red ones are annular and considered to be more unstable. So yeah, that's just showing like those, they're like different incisions. I guess someone's hacking away at the planet with a knife or a sword, or whittling it away or chiseling it. And that's where karmas are struck. I was born 8 days before this eclipse, or 8 days after this eclipse in 1992. And we can see that, you know, it was just the path heading straight to the United States, where I was born in the South. I was born right here. So it's kind of interesting physically to look at eclipses and eclipse patterns. This was the next 50 years on the United States of how the energy of eclipses that we'll see, the incisions from the solar paths, these paths of totality. Again, the blue ones are total eclipses. Like this was, again, 2017. This one's coming up in 2045, and it's going to have an even wider umbra. You're going to be really, really, really powerful, 2045. And 2024. So it's seeing, like, if you look at just putting them on a graph like that is very interesting. Here was the last 50 years before 2000, so 1950 to 2000. Here's that one where I was born, I was talking about. It was an annular one. So it stopped right here. Right, I actually lived right here for 6 years. But, you know, it's interesting, right? Energetically, for next 50 years, last 50. K2, again, I want to talk about the southern node that eats the sun more. It's because in some other senses, it's considered the more spiritual one and the less hungry. It's like completion, non-use, sense control. It's also, you know, the things we neglect and our inattentiveness in life, and the things that we deny. The southern node doesn't have a head, even though in this picture it does, but we would essentially associate the southern node with just a decapitated body with no head. So there's very great control of the senses because there are no senses, right? You are forced into a spiritual world because that's your propensity. You have unrestricted access to asceticism, or to become a sannyasin or a great spiritual master, because you can dissolve your hunger. You can't have the north node without the south node. So the idea is to move away from extremes, and to find balance. And Ketu is much more spiritual in this sense, because it's much more about completion. North node, the head of the dragon, is much more in a state of incompletion. And the, like, back to the north node real quick, the north node is not feeling super stable. And that's going to be the things where we're trying to develop in our lives. And it's almost as if the dissolving energy, that energy that's going down the drain here from the southern node, from eating the sun, is moving towards the northern node, who eats the moon. And it's like, this is where that energy of where we're fed up and where we're done, we absolutely cannot. We must drain the bathtub because we're so filled in the past life, in the past karmas. Like, I was so unbelievably rich and wealthy in my last life, and I never had to do anything, and I never developed myself emotionally, spiritually, and I just was totally, I didn't do anything for the last maybe 10 lives. Well, now I'm full. That energy drains out. It moves over to the northern node, and now in this incarnation I have no money, or I have no resources, and I'm fed up with it. Or maybe it's like now it's feeding this energy for more community building, or maybe now I'm doing great works of charity, right? Just because these images are demons doesn't mean they show or frightening or horrifying, and certainly they represent terrifying things. It doesn't mean that they don't show us doorways to greater divinity and greater consciousness by balancing what is ugly in ourselves. Just because something's ugly about you doesn't mean it's not there, right? You can't just not look at something. That's also negligent. And that's something that's bad about the southern node here, is there's a sense of negligence where it's like, I'm just going to pretend that's not there. Whereas the northern node doesn't pretend things aren't there. It's obsessed with them until he destroys them. Like, I'm going to make them not there by obsessing about it endlessly. And the northern node that obsesses also isn't, the lunar eclipses, when the northern node eats the moon, there's going to be half of the world that can't see it. And then there's only going to be some people that can see the eclipse at moonset or at moonrise. And then there's, and the example of April 15th, 2014, all of North America could see this total lunar eclipse. And a lot of major regions of South America and Brazil, most of Brazil. So we can see that eclipses form different patterns that affect us differently based on when we were born, what type of eclipse, which luminary, sun or the moon, and who can actually see it, who can it affect. It affects the whole planet, but I think it shows more about the people in the regions where the eclipse is actually visible. So there's a lot more astronomy that goes into working with the eclipses, and a lot more care has to go into their interpretation and their own cycles. But like I said, those cycles that we see through them they can reveal so many eye-opening things that point us to our ancestry and where we come from, the things that propel us and move us forward. Why am I good at this? Why am I good at singing? Why am I good at business? Why am I good at this and that? Why can I not have children? Why, the painful things too, like why? Well, we don't always have why answers, but sometimes the eclipses can give us windows. And if a really talented astrologer in evolutionary astrology, I've seen some people pull up some really interesting stuff with the Saros cycle and eclipses to determine, like, what are some themes of your life? And these can span thousands of years. Imagine if you were born 1200 years ago in the same exact ecliptic formation that I was born at, right? Like, what was I doing? What was my consciousness, or what was spirit doing 1200 years ago? And it's about mapping that. So this is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that the eclipses are really intense. And I know that this is just an overview, because the best way to study the eclipses is absolute best way is to study them relative to your sign, and they affect the planets they move through, right? If like Venus is with the North Node in a chart, it's going to behave in a radically different way. It's going to have it's like they're intensifiers, right? They're shadowy intensifiers. If Venus is up here, if Venus is hanging out with the northern node or the southern node, it's going to be more negligent. It's going to have a more spiritual bent. There's going to be not as much interest in fine sensual things that Venus is known for, right? There'll be a turning away from sensory delights. Whereas Venus and North Node, where you're hungry, is someone who actually maybe even, destroys themselves with the things that they want. How many people do we know that do that? And that's not just, like an overdose, like an addict who takes something to the extreme, right? Or uses a medicine. Maybe the medicine was even prescribed to him, but it was pushed over into a usage, into a extreme that is not conducive to life. So as such, Rahu and Ketu can be very, very dangerous, and they represent toxins and proteins. What is a neurotoxin except proteins that destroy other proteins? And proteins are the building blocks of life, as we see here. And toxins undo protein structures, neurotoxins, and cause major damage. But also you can use neurotoxins as medicine, right? Viper venom is used today in in certain cardiothoracic indications where the blood pressure or the integrity of the heart is hypertensive, or it needs some type of relaxation, or the channels of the heart are immediately under threat. Well, a good neurotoxin can change your blood pressure and save your life, which is why Mercury is one of the most mitigating factors in a chart. If you have Mercury with the North Node or the South Node, you're generally going to be able to harness them a lot more and use those tools for you better. Like, for example, my sun is conjoined my North Node, but my Mercury is there, but also so is a bunch of other planets. It's a complicated house. But the Mercury is going to allow me to wield, and I'm still going to get slammed with North Node, South Node karmic things, but I'm not going to be totally unaware of it, because I have tools like, say, astrology, for example, to predict and to prepare myself for the themes. I can orient myself relative to the nodes, so I'm not just totally taken by surprise every single time an eclipse happens. And like, that's the difference, right? You can't change the event, but I can watch it come to me from the horizon, and I can watch it, gain in momentum and recede in momentum. And there's a mindfulness and awareness there that is totally different than if you're just not paying attention and life strikes you down. But like I said, there's really good things that come from the North Node. South Node can give immeasurable wealth. South Node also rules inheritances, our inherited money. It's our inherited finances, our inherited genetics, our inherited diseases, our inherited emotional traumas and mental illnesses. Mental illness, trust me, can be transferred 100%. If you think it can't, you got another thing coming, honey. And that's all node stuff. Ancestral trauma, when people talk about that, if you don't know what that means, they're talking about the nodes. I have some friends that do some work in New Orleans around that, like who do some healing ceremony around their ancestors who were in the transatlantic slave trade. They're Black, and their ancestors, they try to reach out to and heal that, and they also know that healing themselves heals their ancestors, because we're here in the now, we're present. So we're in the middle of the southern and the northern, what we want and what we don't want, where we're going, where we come from. where we are excess, where we're deficient. We're in the middle of this axis, and if we can maintain the equilibrium, then we can develop a lot faster spiritually. And that's kind of where I want to conclude this presentation. It is a lot to think about, but the nodes are, the nodes are an amazing tool. So check out, review these lectures, or go ahead and go on into the signs and houses, and we can start stacking and putting things together. Like, what does the North Node mean in Capricorn? What does the North Node mean in Cancer? And we'll see that the North and the South Node are always opposite each other, right? They always have to be, they always have to be opposing each other in the chart. So if your North Node is in Capricorn, your South Node is going to be in Cancer, or vice versa, right? So thank you guys, and email me if you have any questions, and check out my website. You can see more blogs on North Node or the planets there as well.